I've seen in a few different places online where people are holding off moving to N.I.N.A because of the perceived complexity around the new sequencer and that they would rather stick with the program they're currently using. I can completely understand that, but I think this isn't so much about complexity as it is familiarity. If you were brand new to this hobby today, I think you would find that whatever program you're using right now has a relatively steep learning curve. I mean, if we're being honest, the whole hobby has a pretty steep learning curve. Let's see if any of this sounds familiar. I want to image a couple targets tonight, but between the meridian flips, dithering, autofocus runs, I don't know how to set my image count so it all works out. Why can't I just set this thing to take pictures while M101 is actually high enough for me to see? Clouds are supposed to roll through in the middle of the night. I hope I don't lose my whole session. I want to finish imaging my target tonight, but it isn't up until 3 a.m. How many seconds are there until 3 a.m.? N.I.N.A's sequencer is being reworked to solve problems just like these. Is it new? Yes. Does that mean you need to be afraid of it? No. What you're going to find is that many of the concepts in the new sequencer are things you're already familiar with. You just need to take a little time to learn the terminology and interface. If this video helps you out, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. That really helps me make sure we can get this and a lot more content like it in front of others that could use it as well. All right, let's go. It's time to teach some old dogs a few new tricks. First, let's cover some basic terminology. Instruction. This is something N.I.N.A needs to do. Here's a sample list of instructions. It contains everything from cooling the camera, unparking the mount, changing filters, centering targets, opening your dome, plus a whole lot more. Notice that both the open dome shutter and center and rotate instructions have red warning symbols. This is because I don't have the dome or rotator connected to N.I.N.A. If these instructions were executed, both commands would have been skipped. Loop condition. This is how N.I.N.A determines if we should keep looping through one or more instructions. Here is the list currently available in N.I.N.A. Everything from looping a set number of times, looping for a specific amount of time, looping until a defined time, like dawn, or looping while a target is above your defined horizon. An interesting side note is that you can define multiple looping conditions, and as soon as one matches or completes, the loop will end. Trigger condition. These are conditions that are evaluated after every single instruction completes. Basically, it is a way to check to see if something special needs to happen, like a meridian flip, a dither, autofocus. Once a trigger matches, the action will take place, then return control back to the next instruction. If you attach multiple triggers, they will all individually be checked after each instruction. Instruction sets. These are containers that can hold our instructions. There are three types of instruction sets. Parallel instruction set. This type of set tells all included instructions to execute simultaneously in parallel. An example of this would be at the beginning of the night when we want to open our dome, unpark the mount, and cool the camera all at the same time. Sequential instruction set. This type of set tells any included instructions to execute one at a time and not to move on until the previous instruction is completed. This is common in imaging sequences where we want to switch filters, autofocus, and take exposures. We also have the ability to add any looping conditions and triggers here. The last instruction set type is the deep sky object sequence. This is a special sequential instruction set that includes target information. Because we have target information, in here we can use commands that need this knowledge, like plate solving via the center instruction or performing a meridian flip with a trigger. One more thing about containers. You can put containers inside containers. The nested container will show up as an instruction within the parent container. Here's an example of a nested instruction set. Because the parent container is sequential, we will not get to this other container's contents until after we start guiding. Once we get to the nested container, by its definition, we will execute its contents sequentially as well. Once done, we will execute the final park scope instruction. The last thing I want to show you before we dig in is the 1.11 basic sequencer. It's not a whole lot different than the 1.10 sequencer. If you're already experienced with N.I.N.A, I want you to think about the settings here and how they are all either instructions or triggers, and that looping conditions and many of the other features you're about to see don't exist in the basic sequencer. So let's go ahead and jump into the advanced sequencer here. Now, first thing, let's look at the interface. The advanced sequencer, the primary area here where the sequence will be set, has three areas: a sequence start, the main sequencing area where most of our imaging targets should go, and then sequence end. On the right-hand side, we have all of our instructions. So you can see we have instruction sets listed at the top, camera commands, dome commands, which I'll minimize because we're not going to use a dome in our examples, the filter wheel, flat device, which I'll minimize, focuser commands, guiding commands, loop conditions, rotator, which I'll minimize, safety monitor, I'll also minimize, a switch, we will minimize, telescope-based commands, and various utility commands. These are all here, and these are all instructions. We have a couple templates that come with N.I.N.A out of the box, and we will see over time we can add our own here as we customize them. And then targets. Okay, to best illustrate how the sequences flow and how the various instruction sets work and process instructions individually, I've pulled together this simple sequence. Now, this is not a sequence you would ever use. This is just for demonstration purposes. So you'll notice we don't have anything in the start area or end area, so we'll focus here just on the primary section. And each one of these lines is considered an instruction they will execute from top down sequentially. You can see we have an individual instruction first, take exposure. This will take a 10-second exposure. Once that's complete, we will move on to the next instruction, which happens to be a parallel instruction set. If I expand that, you can see there are 4 instructions within this set that will all execute simultaneously. Now, most of these will execute very, very quickly. However, cooling the camera will take a little bit longer, and only after all 4 have completed will we move on to the next line, which is to take another 10-second exposure. Once that exposure is completed, we're going to move on to a sequential instruction set. Within this set, we're going to take a series of 5 2-second exposures, one after another sequentially. After those have completed, we're going to move on to a deep sky object sequence. Now, this only differs from a sequential instruction set in that it has targeting information available so that we can pull information like the meridian, horizon, altitude, etc. So within this particular sequential instruction set, we are going to do 5 commands, one after the other. We're going to switch the filter to red. We're going to take a 2-second exposure. We're going to switch the filter to green. We're going to move the focuser to the position of 30,000. And then we're going to take a final 2-second exposure before completing our sequence. While you can monitor this on the sequencer page, you can also, within imaging, see the sequence as it executes. To best monitor this for our instructional purposes, I'm going to go ahead and expand all of these objects, and we're going to go ahead and start the sequence. Notice the sequence is running, the 10-second exposure is underway, we can see it churning, and we can even watch it down here as well. Once that's complete, we're going to move on to our parallel instruction set, most of which will execute very quickly. We can see that our cooling the camera is still underway, and once that's complete, we're going to move on to another 10-second exposure. That's complete. We're underway with another 10-second exposure. If I go to imaging, you can see that we're monitoring. We can see everything that is completed, and our 10-second exposure is underway. Once that is complete, we're going to move into this instruction set and begin taking our 2-second exposures. As you can see, we're completing them, we're flagging them as completed, and we're moving onward. Once this final exposure is complete, we will move on to our deep sky object sequence. And again, go through as expected sequentially. And we can see it's been completed both here on the imaging page and in the sequencer. So as we dive in to the advanced sequencer, I'm going to take a crawl, walk, run, fly approach. Let's start with the crawling first. We'll look at the pieces and how they connect together. So first thing, let's look at beginning of night. So we have a template for that. Let's look at the basic sequence startup, and notice it is a drag and drop interface. I can add the instruction in this area, here even at the end, or at the startup. We're going to go ahead and add it to the startup area. Notice that the basic sequence startup that comes with N.I.N.A is parallel processed, and I can minimize these objects. There are 3 instructions, and because it's parallel processed, every one of these will execute simultaneously, and we will not leave this processing block and move onward until all 3 of these are completed. The first one's an annotation. I'm going to go ahead and delete that to clean it out of our space. The next 2 are cool camera and unpark scope. Obviously, these 2 things can happen simultaneously. There's no reason they would have to happen sequentially. So as part of our basic sequence startup, we can have our camera cooled to a temperature, here -10 Celsius, and we can unpark the scope very easily. Now let's look at basic sequence end. I'm again going to clean up the annotations. We're going to do that just so we can see a little bit more on the screen here. Now notice the basic sequence end that comes with N.I.N.A can also be minimized, and that it is a sequential set, meaning all of the conditions must be executed in order. The next thing to notice is that there is actually a nested parallel sequence within the basic sequence end. And if I minimize that, we can see it will be treated as a single instruction. So we have an instruction here that says execute this container, and then we have a second instruction that says when we're done with this container, with this instruction set, execute this external script if it's defined. So at the basic sequence end, what will we do? Well, we have no instruction before this container. We'll come into this container, which we need to execute in parallel, and we'll execute warming the camera and parking the scope. When both of those are completed, we can move on to the next instruction in the sequence, which will be running this external script. So again, we can minimize this. Now let's build a basic sequence here to start. We're going to use a sequential instruction set. So I'll just drag that over to our area. We have an area for triggers, looping conditions, and instructions. Let's go ahead and add taking an exposure. So now we have a single instruction in this set, and we can say, let's take a single 60-second exposure. It is a light frame, binned 1 by 1, gain 100, offset 25, which come from our equipment parameters. Now for a one-shot color camera, this may be all you need to take a single exposure. Let's say we want to take 10 pictures though. I could drop 10 of these instructions in a row, but that'd be highly inefficient. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a looping condition. While I could grab a looping condition from the right, I can use this plus sign here. And let's just say we want to loop 4 iterations, and we'll say 10. Notice when I complete the 10 iteration configuration, there is a counter off to the right here. And this particular counter, when the sequence is running, you will be able to see it increment. So how does this work? Well, after we cool the camera and unpark the scope, and both of these are complete, we will exit that and come down into our next instruction set in line, which will have us loop through 10 times and take 10 60-second images. When that's completed, we'll move on to our basic sequence, which should warm the camera, park the scope, and when those are completed, if you remember, it can also execute a script. Now looking at this is fine, but what about something like dithering? Well, we can add a dither very easily. One way we can do it is simply add it as a trigger. Now notice When I grab that here, it has a lightning bolt, which reminds me that this is a trigger condition. I could have also added it this way from this menu. Now I'm going to set my dither after exposures to be 3. So let's now look at how this instruction set will work. We have a looping condition that says we should perform the following instructions 10 times. So we'll go in the first time and we'll take a 60-second image, and immediately after completing this instruction, we're going to check the dither after exposures because it is a trigger. Have we had a total of 3 exposures yet? No, we'll move on. We'll go back to our looping condition. It'll tell us to loop again. We'll take our second picture. After completing an instruction, we'll check our dither. It doesn't match yet. But after the third time we take a picture, it will match. So we'll pause our instructions. We will complete our dither as a result of the trigger. And then we'll drop right back into our instruction loop where we left off. If I had multiple instructions here, upon the completion of every single individual instruction, all dither conditions will be checked. So there is another way to do this. There's actually something called take many exposures. Now notice take many exposures as an instruction has a loop built into it. Here I can say take 10 60-second light frames, bidding 1 by 1, gain 100, offset 25. Now because I'm taking an image here, I don't need my image command anymore. And because I have a loop of 10 built in to this in single instruction, I don't need my loop. So you can see we've simplified this overall instruction set. Now, this is a special type of instruction, and it is intelligent enough to know that it includes the loop, and therefore every single image that it takes, it will still check the triggers. So we're not going to wait for 10 images before we check our triggers. We are going to check our triggering conditions every single exposure upon completion. What about autofocus? Maybe we're concerned that we need to autofocus over time. So we can add another condition here, another trigger. And this one is autofocus after HFR increase. So we can set the parameters or leave them the way they are. And notice we now have 2 triggers. We're going to check both of these triggers after the completion of every single instruction, in this case, any looped image. So as we go ahead and take an image, we're going to check, do we need to dither? And do we need to autofocus based on HFR? If not, then we'll continue onward. And again, we're going to check this every time. And because this has a built-in loop condition, we will take 10 images, checking dithering and autofocus requirements after every exposure. Now, this could be a very simple workflow for a one-shot color camera. What if we want to do monochrome imaging? How would we change the filter? Well, we could do simply a switch filter here, and we can enforce this filter. I could say, okay, I want to switch the filter to luminance, and then I'm going to take 10 images. So the way this will work is we will enter this block. We will switch the filter to luminance if it's not already luminance. We will go ahead and take 10 exposures looping, and we will stay here in this loop on this instruction line. But after we switch the filter, we check these triggers. And then after every single image, we also check these triggers to see if they match. There's another command that you should see, and this is a smart exposure. Now a smart exposure does have a loop built in and as our timer, and it looks quite similar to take many exposures. However, it also has a filter option and a dithering option built into a single command. This allows us to lose our switch filter instruction, take many exposures, as well as our dither trigger. Now we actually have the dithering trigger, our filter change, our loop, and the image all built into this single instruction. We will still, after every image, see if we need a dither, and also, of course, check the autofocus requirement. Now, for mono, it's very likely we want a little bit more than just luminance. So I could actually add multiple smart exposure lines here, but another option is to just simply clone this line by clicking the icon and clicking the clone button. And I'm going to do this a handful of times. And I'll change this to red, green, and blue. Now, once we enter this set, we will take 10 luminance, dithering as necessary and always checking for autofocus. Then we'll move on to 10 red images, dithering and autofocusing as necessary. The same with green and then blue before we ultimately exit this and go on to our sequence end. Now, one thing you'll notice here is that we are autofocusing after HFR increase, but we probably also need to autofocus after every filter change. Now, there's a couple ways to do this. I could add autofocus commands in here in between each of these exposure types. But rather than doing that, there is actually a trigger that we can use that says autofocus after filter change. Now, because this is a trigger, it will be checked after every single exposure or every instruction, regardless of the instruction, which means that as soon as the filter changes, autofocus after filter change will trigger and an autofocus will occur. So this is a pretty straightforward mono imaging instruction set. Let's go ahead and name this LRGB imaging. Let's move on to walking. What we're going to do here is we are going to introduce targeting information. So we're going to bring our deep sky object sequence into our sequencing area, and notice that this is again another sequential list, but it has our target information that can be placed here. Now, what are some things that could have to do with the target that we may want to add here from an imaging perspective? Well, a couple easy ones right off the bat. We may want to center this, so basically slew and plate solve to center the object in question. We may want to run a generic autofocus to make sure we're focused at the beginning of the evening. And we may also want to start our guiding. Another thing that can be affected, certainly by a target, would be a meridian flip. So we can very quickly add that as well. This, however, is a trigger because it needs to be checked after every instruction completes to see if a meridian flip needs to happen right away. Now that we have targeting information, meridian flips configured, we will plate solve and center the object. We will autofocus, and then we will start guiding. Now we need to start imaging. Rather than rebuilding this LRGB imaging container and putting those instructions in here, we can simply drag it up and drop it in that container. And now this container is nested within our deep sky object sequence. And notice if I minimize this, it just is another instruction in the list. Because this process is sequentially, we will center. After completion, we'll check meridian flip. Run autofocus, check meridian flip. Start guiding, check meridian flip, and then start processing this container. Now, once we enter this container, that meridian flip trigger will also be inherited within this particular container. So it's not just our autofocus triggers that will be looked at upon completion of every one of these instructions, but also the meridian flip, because it has been inherited by the larger container. Now let's go up here and we'll rename this one my broadband target. We're going to save this for use later, so we'll simply click Save. Now, as soon as I clicked Save, I could come to Templates and notice it exists here. I also may want to do some narrowband imaging, so I could change this to be SHO imaging. I can delete one of these lines. I could then change it to S, H, and O. After setting the filters, I may choose to do much longer exposures. In my particular case, I'm going to go ahead and do 5-minute exposures. And I'm going to actually dither for my narrowband every single frame. So we can go ahead and save this as my narrowband target. Now we have broadband and narrowband in place. While we're saving things, let's go up into our sequence startup. And I know my particular camera, I'm going to cool to -15. I'm going to save this as my startup -15C. I'm also going to go into the end, and because we've cleaned this up and we've gotten rid of all of those other unnecessary annotations, and it's nice and clean, I'm going to go ahead and call this my end, and we'll save that as well. So let's go ahead and delete everything here. And we got a nice blank sequence area, and we can move on. So let's move on to running. Here we're going to reuse our objects. So what we want to do here in this particular case is I've decided I want to image M90. I'm going to search for it like I normally would. I find the galaxy. It's a broadband target. I'm going to go ahead and set it for framing. When I've got this framed, I see that it is the way I want, or I can make a modification to it, and I'm going to click Add Sequence Target, Sequencer, and notice I have the built-in basic sequence target that N.I.N.A comes with, but I also have my broadband target and my narrowband target. In this case, I'm going to select my broadband target. That brings us to our advanced sequencer, and notice we see M90. We have the information has been populated, the chart is updated, we can see our configuration from our template is ready to go. So before we would want to run this sequence, if this is the only thing we wanted to image at night, we would want to get our start and end set up. So we'll go ahead and add our start sequence, which will cool our camera and unpark our scope. And we can add our customized end sequence, which is just the cleaned up end sequence that came with N.I.N.A. If I minimize everything, you can see I'll go through my startup process, then I'll do all of my imaging for the evening, and then I'm going to wrap it up by warming the camera and parking the scope. Now let's go back to the Sky Atlas and say, well, I also, at the end of the night, it looked like I had a little time left over because M90 doesn't reach dawn. So I'm going to go ahead and see if there's something else I can do, and I've been meaning to image M8. So I'll go look at M8, the Lagoon Nebula. Now this is going to be a narrowband target, and it does work for me at the end of the evening. So I'm going to set this for framing. I'll assume that this is okay framing for me right now, and I'm going to add this to a sequence, and in this case I'm going to add this to my narrowband target. Now notice that it adds a new narrowband target based on my template after the previous broadband target that I had in place. So my startup is still here, M90 is still here, the end is here, and M8 has been inserted. Notice that it did pull in the appropriate configuration because I selected the appropriate template that I had previously saved. Now there is something to consider here though. This particular target, M8, is not available until maybe about 2 a.m. and M90 is available until after 3. So I have to make a determination of how do I make sure that do I only want to take 40 images and move on? If I do that, it's very likely that M8 may not have risen yet. So how can we work this out? So there'll still be some things that you may need to work out here, but the best way to deal with something like this in the advanced sequencer, rather than trying to do the math and figuring out exactly how many images I need to take and where I think the dithering and meridian flip is going to affect me and trying to ballpark exactly the time this particular target will end, I've got a lot more flexibility in the advanced sequencer. So what we're going to do is we're going to put a loop condition in here to basically say, I want you to run through this loop of taking 10 of each type of filter, but I want to make sure that I keep taking pictures until maybe 2 a.m. And at that point, I'll move on to M8. So let's use a loop condition. And what I'll do here is I'm going to loop until time. And in this case, I'm going to say 2 a.m. And this is a 24-hour clock. So what'll happen here is that I will, once I enter this block, I am configured, I will center the object, I will autofocus, I will start guiding, and then I will start to process this particular nested container. So the way this works is because the loop condition says loop until time, what we'll do is we are going to continue to image and loop through 10 luminance, 10 red, 10 green, 10 blue. And we're going to keep doing that, looping over and over until this clock here expires, until we hit 2 a.m. No matter where we are at that point, we're going to finish that frame. Since our looping condition has expired, even if we're in the middle of a green frame at that point, once that frame ends, if our looping condition has expired, we are actually going to drop out of this and we're going to move on, at which point we'll move on to M8. Now, if I look at M8, notice that, again, maybe this number of frames is not enough, right? I haven't done the math on it, but maybe it's not enough here, or maybe it's too much. So how do I make sure that, I'm not going to get a lot of extra frames I don't need? Well, I certainly want to end at the end of astro dark. So again, I can use another looping condition. This time I'm going to use loop until time again. And when I use loop until time, I'm going to change the time option to astronomical dawn. And that is going to allow me to basically say, keep going through, taking 10 of each until we hit astronomical dawn, at which point I want you to drop out of this loop. Once we drop out of that loop, we're going to move on to the warming of the camera and parking the scope. So you can see these are flexible looping options we never had before, right, in the simple sequencer. The ability to do things like only take pictures while I'm above the horizon line, only take pictures for a certain amount of time. I can always do loop until I do a certain number of iterations, but I can get much more flexible by using things like altitude and certain time frames that can be auto-calculated based on my location. Just as a high-level view again, what are we going to do here with the sequence? We're going to cool the camera to -15 and unpark the scope. We're going to take pictures of M90 looping through that sequence until 2 a.m., at which point we'll exit, move on to M8. We're going to take pictures of M8 in narrowband until astronomical dawn. And then at that point, we'll warm the camera and park the scope. So now it's time to fly. So let's look at a first problem. That's a little bit more of an advanced problem to solve. Let's say that I'm not going to be around to start this at dusk, and I want to start the sequence earlier in the evening while it's still daylight, assuming that I can do that with my particular setup. How can I make sure that this sequence will not execute until dusk occurs? And on top of that, how can I make sure my camera cooler and the unparking of the scope doesn't occur until that time as well? Well, let's go ahead and see what we can do here. One way to solve this problem is I can pull in another sequential instruction set above our image containers. And what I'm going to do here is a couple simple things. So the first thing is I'm going to name it, and I'm going to name this Start at Dark. Now that in itself doesn't do anything except remind me the purpose of this container. Now I'm going to use a utility command, and there's a utility command that says wait for time, and it's going to be an instruction. And I'm going to set this time to astronomical dusk, which will automatically be calculated based on my location. How many seconds are there until 3 a.m.? So now this is going to go ahead and wait until this time occurs before moving on. Well, that's great, but if you look at the order of things, what's going to happen even before that? I'm going to cool the camera and unpark the scope as soon as I hit play. So one option we have is I can grab this container and just move it below the wait time. So since nothing is in the start area, we'll immediately move on to start at dark, at which point we're going to hit the first instruction in line, which says we need to wait until this time. After that one completes, we move on to the second instruction, which is our startup sequence, which will run in parallel, cooling the camera and unparking the scope. Once those are both completed, we'll move on to M90, shoot our images for the evening, then move on at 2 a.m. to M8 until dawn, at which point we'll kick off our ends part of the sequence. Let's think about another problem here. This will be problem 2. We're expecting clouds this evening, and we're worried we're going to lose our guiding and maybe lose a lot of our imaging. We're going to have some intermittent clouds for the evening. So can we deal with that as well? Well, there is a newer way we can deal with that in the advanced sequencer. What we can do here is use a new instruction called center after drift. So let's go into M90 here, and we can use a trigger called center after drift. And I'll put it up here at the top of the container. In this particular trigger, I could have put it down here in these triggering conditions. It doesn't matter. Remember, they will be inherited. So the way center after drift works is that it says, I'm going to try to plate solve in the background every so many exposures. In this case, for our LRGB, since they're only 60 seconds each, let's say every 5. We're going to plate solve in the background every 5th image. We're going to look at that image
And we're going to see if we've drifted too much. Now, this could occur if you've had clouds and your tracking was off. Now, I wouldn't expect a decent amount to drift that frequently, so you can play with these variables. The two items you can modify for center after drift are how frequently you want to plate solve in the background to look for drift and how much drift. Now, it does an automatic calculation here based on some of your equipment parameters. You may want to verify this, but as an example, if I say I want to set this to maybe 1 arc minute, notice that's going to be 98 pixels. Think about dithering. It's going to cause a little bit of drift in itself. So maybe I want to say something like 2 or 3 arc minutes with my configuration. So what this will actually do here is say, if I have clouds, if I lose my tracking and I start to drift and I'm not perfectly centered anymore, what I'm going to do is every 5 exposures, I'm going to check that. I'm going to plate solve in the background. If it looks like I've moved by 294 pixels or more, I'm going to go ahead and enforce that plate solve. I'm basically going to recenter the object. Now, another thing that you can put along with that command, which may not be a bad idea if you think that you could lose your center of your target, there's a guiding command that is restore guiding, and you can put that in here as well. And what restore guiding will do is, if guiding is ever lost at some point in the evening, this particular trigger can try to restore the guiding back in place. So again, now, I don't think many of you, if you have cloudy nights, are going to try to image, but there are times where this could be something that could be interesting, right? Where you have an evening that's going to be, most of the time clear, but there could be an occasional bit of clouds that come through, and we've all had those nights where that ruined the rest of our evening. With center after drift and restore guiding, it's possible for us to get back on track once the clouds have cleared. This is something you could not have done without the advanced sequencer.
I hope you found this video helpful. I'm pretty excited about the new sequencer and all the doors it will open up to us. Better error handling, intelligent imaging loops, and advanced instructions, they're all coming because of this sequencer change. My suggestion, get on board. You'll be happy you did. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and please drop me a comment below if you found this helpful, have any suggestions, or want to see any other content from me. For more of my astrophotography, or to get in touch, visit my website at www.patriotastro.com or find me on Instagram as patriot_astro. Thanks for watching, and clear skies.